What if I told you that the difference between people who struggle to get their ideas heard and those who effortlessly persuade, inspire, and lead others has nothing to do with charisma, natural talent, or even the quality of their ideas? The real difference is that some people have mastered the hidden dynamics of human communication, while others are unknowingly sabotaging every conversation they enter. Every single day, you engage in dozens of conversations, from casual small talk to critical negotiations, from team meetings to intimate discussions with loved ones. Your ability to communicate effectively determines the quality of your relationships, your career trajectory, and ultimately, the life you build. But here's the problem. Most people approach communication with a completely backwards understanding of how influence actually works. They focus on what they want to say instead of what others need to hear. They try to win arguments instead of building bridges. They talk when they should listen and stay silent when they should speak. The result is missed opportunities, damaged relationships, and a constant feeling that nobody really understands or values what you have to offer. But what if there was a way to completely transform how you connect with others? What if you could develop the same type of influential communication that allows great leaders to inspire movements, skilled negotiators to create win-win outcomes, and master communicators to turn strangers into devoted allies? That's exactly what we're going to explore today. You're about to discover the hidden psychology behind influential communication. Learn how to read people's unspoken signals and true intentions, and master the techniques that will allow you to persuade virtually anyone while maintaining genuine integrity and respect. This isn't about manipulation or deceptive tactics. This is about becoming more effective, more authentic, and more impactful in every conversation you have. By the end of this journey, you'll have a completely different relationship with communication. Instead of feeling anxious or uncertain in important conversations, you'll approach each interaction with confidence, knowing that you have the skills to connect deeply, persuade effectively, and create outcomes that serve everyone involved. Chapter 1: The Foundation of Influential Communication. Most people think communication is about transmitting information from one person to another, like sending a file from one computer to another. But this mechanical view of communication is precisely what keeps people stuck in ineffective patterns. Real communication isn't about data transfer. It's about creating shared understanding, building emotional connection, and influencing how people think, feel, and act. The most influential communicators understand something that average communicators miss entirely. Every conversation happens on multiple levels simultaneously. There's the content level, which is the actual words being spoken and the information being exchanged. But beneath this surface level are several deeper layers that actually determine whether communication succeeds or fails. The emotional level involves the feelings being expressed and experienced during the conversation. People make decisions based primarily on emotions and then justify those decisions with logic. If you focus only on logical arguments while ignoring emotional dynamics, your influence will remain severely limited. The relationship level concerns how the conversation affects the connection between the people involved. Every interaction either strengthens or weakens relationships. Every statement either builds trust or erodes it. The identity level touches on how the conversation affects people's sense of self. People are deeply invested in maintaining consistent self-images. When you threaten someone's identity, they become defensive and resistant. When you reinforce positive aspects of their identity, they become open and receptive. The power level involves the status dynamics and influence patterns within the conversation. Who is leading? Who is following? Who has credibility? Who is seeking approval? These power dynamics shape everything about how the conversation unfolds. Master communicators operate consciously on all these levels simultaneously. They're not just thinking about what information to convey. They're managing emotional states, strengthening relationships, honoring identities, and navigating power dynamics. This multidimensional awareness is what separates truly influential communication from mere information exchange. The first principle of influential communication is that influence flows from understanding, not from assertion. Most people approach conversations trying to make themselves understood. They focus all their energy on crafting compelling arguments, finding perfect words, and presenting their ideas clearly. But this approach fundamentally misunderstands how influence works. People don't change their minds because you present a logical argument. They change their minds when they feel understood, when their concerns are addressed, and when they can see how your proposal serves their interests. This means that influential communication must begin with deep understanding of the other person's perspective, motivations, fears, and desires. Before you ever attempt to persuade someone, you need to understand what they care about, what they're afraid of, what they're trying to accomplish, and what constraints they're operating under. This understanding doesn't come from assumptions or stereotypes. It comes from genuine curiosity and careful observation. The second principle is that resistance is information, not opposition. When people push back against your ideas, most communicators see this as a problem to overcome. They respond by arguing harder, presenting more evidence, or trying to overwhelm resistance through force of personality. But this approach transforms every conversation into a battle and makes influence nearly impossible. Skilled communicators view resistance completely differently. When someone objects to your idea, they're actually giving you valuable information about their concerns, their priorities, and what would need to change for them to feel comfortable agreeing. Instead of fighting resistance, influential communicators welcome it as data that helps them refine their approach. When someone says, "I don't think that will work," unskilled communicators hear you're wrong and become defensive. Skilled communicators hear, "I have concerns about specific aspects that you haven't addressed yet," and they become curious about what those concerns are. The third principle is that context shapes meaning more than content. The same words can have completely different effects depending on when they're said, how they're said, who says them, and what precedes them. Influential communicators are masters of contextual awareness. They understand that timing matters enormously. The same message that would be rejected in one moment might be enthusiastically embraced in another. They pay attention to the emotional state of everyone involved. People in anxious states process information differently than people in curious states. They're sensitive to environmental factors. The same conversation will go differently in a formal conference room versus a casual coffee shop. They understand relational history. Your third conversation with someone operates under completely different dynamics than your first. The fourth principle is that authenticity and strategy aren't opposites. Many people believe that being strategic in communication means being manipulative or inauthentic. They think you have to choose between being genuine and being effective. But this is a false dichotomy that limits both authenticity and influence. Real authenticity means being genuinely yourself, while also being genuinely interested in creating value for others. It means expressing your truth in ways that others can receive, rather than using authenticity as an excuse for being thoughtlessly blunt. Strategic communication means thinking carefully about how to express yourself most effectively. It means considering your audience and adjusting your approach to maximize understanding. This isn't dishonesty, it's respect. When you speak to a child, you adjust your vocabulary and examples. This isn't manipulation, it's appropriate adaptation. The same principle applies to all communication. True masters of influence are both deeply authentic and highly strategic. They express their genuine selves while also being thoughtful about how to do so most effectively. The fifth principle is that influence is ultimately about serving others, not controlling them. The most sustainable and ethical form of influence comes from genuinely trying to help people achieve their goals, solve their problems, or avoid negative outcomes. When your influence serves others' interests, they welcome it. When your influence primarily serves your own interests at their expense, they resist it. This doesn't mean you can't pursue your own goals through influence. It means that the most effective path to achieving your goals is helping others achieve theirs. When you find ways to align your interests with others' interests, influence becomes natural and effortless. These 5 principles create a foundation that supports all the specific techniques and strategies we'll explore. Without this foundation, techniques become mere tricks that might work occasionally but fail to create lasting influence. With this foundation, every technique becomes more powerful because it's grounded in genuine understanding and authentic connection. Chapter 2: Reading People Accurately. Influential communication requires accurate perception of what's really happening beneath the surface of conversations. Most people are remarkably poor at reading others. They project their own assumptions onto people, miss crucial signals, and misinterpret what they do notice. Developing perceptual accuracy is one of the most valuable skills you can cultivate. The first aspect of reading people accurately is understanding that everyone is always communicating, even when they're silent. Body language, facial expressions, tone of voice, breathing patterns, and micro-expressions reveal far more about people's true thoughts and feelings than their words. Research consistently shows that nonverbal communication carries more weight than verbal content in determining how messages are received and interpreted. When verbal and nonverbal messages contradict each other, people almost always trust the nonverbal signals. If someone says they're fine while their body language screams distress, you'll believe the body language. This means that developing skill at reading nonverbal communication dramatically improves your ability to understand what's really happening in conversations. Baseline behavior provides the foundation for accurate reading. Before you can interpret someone's signals, you need to know how they normally behave. Everyone has different baseline patterns. Some people are naturally animated and expressive. Others are naturally reserved and controlled. A behavior that indicates stress in one person might be completely normal for another. Establish baseline by observing people in neutral, comfortable situations. Notice how they typically hold their body, what their normal facial expressions look like, how they usually gesture, and what their standard tone of voice sounds like. Once you know someone's baseline, deviations from that baseline become meaningful signals. Clusters of behavior provide more reliable information than isolated signals. A single gesture or expression might mean many different things, or might be completely meaningless. But when multiple signals point in the same direction, you can draw more confident conclusions. If someone crosses their arms, that might mean they're cold, comfortable in that position, or defensive. But if they also lean back, break eye contact, tighten their lips, and change their tone of voice, the cluster suggests they're becoming uncomfortable or resistant. Train yourself to look for patterns of multiple signals rather than interpreting individual behaviors in isolation. Changes in behavior often indicate shifts in internal states. When someone suddenly becomes more animated or more withdrawn, when their speech speeds up or slows down, when they start or stop making eye contact, these changes usually reflect changes in what they're thinking or feeling. Pay special attention to sudden shifts. If someone is relaxed and engaged, but suddenly tenses up when you mention a particular topic, that shift tells you something important about their relationship to that topic. Congruence between verbal and nonverbal communication indicates authenticity. When people's words match their body language, tone, and expressions, they're usually being genuine. When there's incongruence, something is being hidden or suppressed. Someone might say they agree with your proposal while their body language shows reservation. This incongruence doesn't necessarily mean they're lying. They might genuinely want to agree, but have unspoken concerns they haven't articulated yet. Your job is to notice the incongruence and gently explore what's creating it. Proxemics, the study of personal space, provides valuable information about relationship dynamics and comfort levels. Different cultures have different norms, but within any given culture, how close people stand or sit relative to each other reveals aspects of their relationship and current emotional state. When people feel comfortable and connected, they naturally reduce distance. When they feel uncomfortable or want to maintain boundaries, they increase distance. If someone consistently maintains more distance from you than they do with others, this suggests some barrier in your relationship that needs attention. Paralinguistics refers to vocal qualities beyond the actual words being spoken. Pitch, volume, pace, rhythm, and vocal tone all carry meaning. The same sentence can communicate completely different messages depending on how it's spoken. A rising inflection at the end of a statement turns it into a question, suggesting uncertainty. A steady, measured pace suggests confidence and control. A rapid pace might indicate excitement or anxiety. A slow pace might indicate thoughtfulness or reluctance. Volume changes often reflect emotional intensity. Someone who normally speaks at moderate volume but suddenly becomes quiet might be feeling vulnerable or cautious. Someone who suddenly becomes louder might be feeling defensive or trying to dominate. Facial expressions are perhaps the most information-rich channel of nonverbal communication. Humans can produce thousands of distinct facial expressions, and we're neurologically wired to read faces from infancy. The 7 universal emotions that show up in facial expressions across all cultures are happiness, sadness, anger, fear, disgust, surprise, and contempt. Each has characteristic facial patterns that remain consistent regardless of cultural background. Micro-expressions are brief facial expressions lasting less than a second that reveal true emotions someone might be trying to conceal. These flickers are extremely difficult to fake and provide windows into authentic feelings. Learning to spot micro-expressions requires training and practice, but even basic awareness that they exist helps you notice when someone's expressed emotion doesn't match their underlying state. Eye behavior provides particularly valuable information. Eye contact patterns, pupil dilation, blink rate, and gaze direction all communicate meaning. In most Western cultures, steady eye contact suggests confidence, engagement, and honesty, while avoiding eye contact might suggest discomfort, deception, or submission. However, context matters enormously. In some cultures, direct eye contact with authority figures is considered disrespectful. When someone is thinking deeply, they often look away, not because they're disengaged, but because they're processing internally. Pupil dilation occurs automatically in response to interest and arousal. When people are engaged and interested, their pupils dilate. When they're disinterested or repelled, pupils contract. This happens unconsciously and is very difficult to fake. Gesture analysis reveals thought processes and emotional states. Self-soothing gestures like touching the face, rubbing hands together, or playing with objects often indicate stress or discomfort. Barrier gestures like crossing arms or placing objects between yourself and another person suggest defensiveness or desire for protection. Illustrator gestures that accompany and emphasize speech suggest engagement and comfort. When people are relaxed and open, they gesture more freely. When they're guarded, gestures become more restricted. Posture communicates power dynamics and emotional states. Open postures with uncrossed limbs and exposed torso suggest confidence and receptivity. Closed postures with crossed limbs and protected torso suggest defensiveness or discomfort. Leaning forward typically indicates engagement and interest. Leaning back often suggests evaluation or withdrawal. Postural mirroring, where people unconsciously adopt similar postures, indicates rapport and connection. Breathing patterns reflect emotional states because breathing is controlled by both conscious and unconscious systems. Rapid, shallow breathing often accompanies anxiety or stress. Deep, slow breathing suggests calmness or deliberate emotional regulation. Held breath often precedes important statements or indicates tension. Noticing changes in breathing patterns helps you detect emotional shifts that might not be visible in other channels. Vocal stress indicators include throat clearing, coughing, or changes in voice quality. When people are nervous or stressed, throat muscles often tighten, affecting voice quality. Someone whose voice suddenly becomes strained or who starts clearing their throat might be experiencing increased stress. Cultural context profoundly shapes nonverbal communication. Gestures, expressions, and behaviors that mean one thing in one culture might mean something completely different in another. What's considered respectful eye contact in one culture might be aggressive in another. Comfortable interpersonal distance varies dramatically across cultures. Developing cultural intelligence means learning to interpret signals within their appropriate cultural contexts, rather than assuming your cultural norms are universal. Individual differences also matter greatly. Some people are naturally more expressive and easier to read. Others maintain poker faces and reveal little through nonverbal channels. Some people have conditions like autism spectrum disorders that affect their nonverbal communication patterns. Avoid rigid interpretations and remain open to individual variations. The goal isn't to become a human lie detector or mind reader. The goal is to develop greater sensitivity to the full range of communication happening in every interaction so you can respond more effectively and build stronger connections. Chapter 3: The Psychology of Persuasion. Persuasion isn't about winning arguments or forcing your views on others. It's about understanding how people make decisions and presenting information in ways that align with natural decision-making processes. The most influential communicators work with human psychology, not against it. Cognitive consistency is one of the most powerful forces in human psychology. People are deeply motivated to maintain consistency between their beliefs, values, and actions. When there's inconsistency, people experience psychological discomfort called cognitive dissonance that motivates them to resolve the inconsistency. You can leverage this drive for consistency by helping people see how your proposal aligns with their existing beliefs and values. When you show someone that what you're suggesting is actually consistent with what they already believe, resistance drops dramatically. Small initial commitments create momentum toward larger commitments through the consistency principle. Once someone takes a small step in a particular direction, they're much more likely to take additional steps that same direction because they've established a self-image as someone who does that type of thing. This is why the foot in the door technique is so effective. If you can get someone to agree to a small request, they become more likely to agree to larger related requests later. They think I already showed I care about this issue by taking that first action, so it would be inconsistent for me to refuse this next request. The key is ensuring the initial request is genuinely small and doesn't create resistance, and that subsequent requests are clearly related to the initial commitment. Reciprocity is a universal human norm. When someone does something for you, you feel obligated to return the favor. This reciprocity principle exists in every human culture and creates powerful influence dynamics. The obligation to reciprocate is triggered even by small favors and even when the favor is unsolicited. If someone gives you something or does something nice for you, you feel indebted even if you didn't ask for it. Strategic use of reciprocity in communication involves providing value before asking for anything in return. Share useful information, offer assistance, give recognition, or provide resources without expecting immediate payback. When you later need something, people who've received value from you will be motivated to reciprocate. The reciprocity principle is stronger when the initial favor feels personalized and thoughtful rather than generic. A small favor that shows you understand someone's specific needs creates more obligation than a large favor that feels impersonal. Social proof leverages people's tendency to look at what others are doing when deciding how to act. When you're uncertain about what to do, you unconsciously scan your environment to see what similar people are doing and use their behavior as a guide. This herding instinct is deeply wired into human psychology because following the crowd was usually adaptive for our ancestors. In modern contexts, social proof means people are more likely to adopt your idea if they believe others, especially similar others, have already adopted it. Testimonials, case studies, statistics about adoption rates, and examples of respected individuals who've embraced your position all provide social proof. The power of social proof increases when the examples come from people your audience identifies with. A CEO is more influenced by what other CEOs are doing than by what entry-level employees are doing. Parents are more influenced by what other parents are doing than by what childless people are doing. Authority influence works because people are conditioned from childhood to defer to legitimate authority figures. When someone perceived as an expert or authority makes a statement, people tend to accept it with less scrutiny than they'd apply to the same statement from a non-authority. Building authority doesn't require traditional credentials, though those help. You build authority through demonstrated expertise, consistent accuracy, and confident presentation. When you show deep knowledge of your domain, make predictions that come true, and communicate with appropriate confidence, people perceive you as authoritative. However, authority influence has important limitations. People are increasingly skeptical of authority claims, especially in domains where expertise is questioned or where authorities have been wrong in the past. Authority is most powerful when combined with other influence principles rather than relied upon exclusively. Liking and rapport dramatically increase influence. People are much more open to being influenced by people they like and feel connected to than by people they dislike or feel distant from. This seems obvious, but most people underestimate how much effort should go into building rapport before attempting to persuade. Several factors consistently increase liking. Physical attractiveness creates an unconscious positive bias. Similarity makes people feel more comfortable and connected. Compliments and recognition make people feel valued. Cooperation toward shared goals builds positive association. Repeated positive exposure increases familiarity and comfort. In communication contexts, building rapport before attempting persuasion dramatically increases your success rate. Invest time in finding common ground, showing genuine interest in the other person, and creating positive interactions before introducing requests or proposals. Scarcity increases perceived value. When something is rare or limited, people want it more than when it's abundant and easily available. This scarcity principle affects both material goods and opportunities, ideas, and even time with people. You can leverage scarcity by highlighting the unique aspects of your proposal, the limited time frame for taking action, or the exclusive nature of the opportunity. However, scarcity must be genuine. False scarcity claims backfire dramatically when people discover the manipulation. Loss aversion is a powerful psychological bias that makes potential losses feel more significant than equivalent potential gains. People are roughly twice as motivated to avoid losses as to pursue equivalent gains. This means that framing your message in terms of what people stand to lose by not acting is often more persuasive than framing it in terms of what they stand to gain by acting. Instead of saying you'll save money with this approach, you might say you'll stop losing money with this approach. Instead of saying this creates opportunities, you might say this prevents you from missing opportunities. However, loss framing needs to be used carefully because excessive fear-based messaging can backfire by creating so much anxiety that people disengage or deny the problem entirely. The contrast principle affects how people evaluate options. When you present something in contrast to something else, the comparison shapes perception more than the absolute qualities of what you're presenting. A moderately priced item seems inexpensive when presented after an expensive item, but seems expensive when presented after a cheap item. You can use contrast strategically by controlling the order in which you present options. If you want someone to accept a particular proposal, You might first present a more extreme alternative that makes your actual proposal seem reasonable by comparison. Anchoring is a cognitive bias where the first number or piece of information people encounter disproportionately influences all subsequent evaluations. Real estate agents use this by showing overpriced houses first to make the house they actually want to sell seem reasonably priced by comparison. In negotiations, the first number put on the table becomes an anchor that shapes all subsequent offers and counteroffers. Even when people know the anchor is arbitrary or unreliable, it still influences their thinking. Strategic use of anchoring means being the first to introduce numbers or frames when possible so you can set favorable reference points. Framing effects demonstrate that how information is presented matters as much as what information is presented. The same facts framed in different ways lead to completely different conclusions and decisions. A medical treatment with a 90% survival rate sounds much more appealing than the same treatment described as having a 10% mortality rate, even though these are mathematically identical. Positive framing emphasizes gains and benefits. Negative framing emphasizes costs and risks. Depending on your goals and audience, different frames will be more effective. Chunking information into digestible pieces prevents cognitive overload. Human working memory can only handle about 7 pieces of information simultaneously. When you present too much information at once, people become overwhelmed and retain almost nothing. Influential communicators break complex messages into smaller chunks and present them sequentially, allowing each piece to be processed before introducing the next. They also use organizing frameworks that help people categorize and remember information more effectively. Chapter 4: Listening as the ultimate influence tool. Most people think influence is primarily about speaking persuasively. But the most influential communicators know that listening is actually their most powerful tool. Deep listening builds trust, reveals information that makes persuasion possible, and makes people feel valued in ways that create lasting influence. The fundamental problem is that most people don't actually listen. They wait for their turn to talk while thinking about what they're going to say next. They hear words without processing meaning. They focus on surface content while missing emotional subtext. This pseudo-listening creates the appearance of communication without the reality of connection. True listening requires suspending your own agenda temporarily and genuinely trying to understand the other person's perspective from the inside. It means setting aside your judgments, assumptions, and planned responses to fully receive what someone is communicating. Several levels of listening exist, and most people operate at only the most superficial levels. Hearing is simply the physical process of sound reaching your ears. It requires no active effort or attention. Passive listening involves being aware that someone is speaking and catching some of what they're saying, but without focused attention or effort to understand deeply. Selective listening means hearing only the parts that interest you or support your existing views while filtering out everything else. Attentive listening involves focused effort to understand the content being communicated. This is what most people think of as good listening, but it's still insufficient for influential communication. Empathic listening goes beyond content to understand the emotions, motivations, and deeper meanings beneath the words. This level of listening makes people feel truly understood. Transformative listening is the deepest level, where you're not just understanding the other person, but helping them clarify and develop their own thinking through the quality of your attention. Active listening techniques demonstrate that you're genuinely engaged and help ensure accurate understanding. These techniques include reflecting, where you rephrase what someone said in your own words to confirm understanding. This might sound like, so what I'm hearing is that you're concerned about the timeline more than the budget. Is that right? This reflection serves multiple purposes. It confirms that you understood correctly. It shows the other person that you're genuinely trying to understand them, and it gives them an opportunity to clarify if you misunderstood. Paraphrasing involves summarizing the main points in condensed form. After someone explains something at length, you might say, "Let me make sure I understand the key points," and then list the main ideas. This demonstrates that you processed their message and extracted the essential elements. Questioning for clarification shows engagement and helps you understand more completely. Instead of assuming you know what someone means, you ask questions that help them articulate their thoughts more fully. Open-ended questions work better than closed questions for deepening understanding. Instead of asking, "Did you like the presentation?" which can be answered with yes or no, you might ask what aspects of the presentation resonated most with you. This invites more detailed, revealing responses. Probing questions help people explore their own thinking more deeply. These are questions like, what leads you to that conclusion? What would need to be true for that to work? Or how does this fit with your other priorities? These questions don't challenge people's ideas. They help people think more carefully about their own positions. Emotional labeling involves naming the emotions you observe in the other person. When you say, "It sounds like you're feeling frustrated about this situation," or "I sense some excitement when you talk about that possibility," you validate people's emotional experiences and encourage them to share more openly. People feel understood at a deep level when someone accurately identifies their emotions, even emotions they haven't explicitly stated. This emotional recognition builds powerful rapport and trust. Silence is a crucial listening tool that most people underutilize. When you ask a question, the natural tendency is to jump in with additional comments or questions if the other person doesn't respond immediately. But silence creates space for people to think and formulate responses. Some of the most valuable insights emerge only after extended silence because people need time to access deeper thoughts and feelings. Train yourself to be comfortable with silence. After asking a question, wait patiently while the other person thinks. Count slowly to 10 in your head if needed to prevent yourself from filling the silence. You'll be amazed at what people share when given adequate time to formulate responses. Attention management is crucial for genuine listening. You cannot listen deeply while multitasking, checking your phone, or thinking about other matters. Deep listening requires directing your full attention to the other person and what they're communicating. This means eliminating distractions, putting away devices, making appropriate eye contact, and orienting your body toward the speaker. These physical behaviors aren't just courtesy. They actually enhance your ability to process what's being communicated by signaling to your own brain that this conversation deserves full attention. Empathy blocks prevent genuine listening, even when you're trying to pay attention. These mental habits filter and distort what you hear. Judging involves evaluating what someone says as good or bad, right or wrong, rather than trying to understand their perspective. When you're judging, you're not really listening. you're categorizing and reacting. Advising means jumping to solutions before fully understanding the problem. Many people, especially men, tend to move immediately into fix-it mode when someone shares a concern. But often, people aren't looking for solutions. They're looking for understanding and validation. Sparring means arguing with or debating what someone is saying rather than trying to understand it. Some people treat every conversation as an intellectual competition where they need to prove their intelligence by poking holes in others' arguments. Derailing happens when you redirect conversation to your own experiences and away from what the other person was sharing. This often takes the form of "me too" stories, where someone shares something and you immediately launch into your own similar experience. Placating involves agreeing superficially to smooth over conflict rather than genuinely engaging with difficult content. This might look like listening, but it's actually a way of avoiding real engagement. Each of these empathy blocks prevents genuine understanding and damages trust. Learning to recognize when you're falling into these patterns allows you to consciously redirect yourself back to genuine listening. Listening for what's not said is as important as hearing what is said. People often communicate most important information indirectly through what they avoid, what they emphasize, and what patterns emerge across multiple statements. Topics someone repeatedly returns to are usually significant. When someone keeps circling back to particular concerns or themes, those topics deserve special attention, even if the person claims they're not important. Topics someone avoids completely might be even more significant. If you notice conspicuous gaps where you'd expect certain subjects to come up, but they never do, those absences tell you something. Emotional intensity around particular topics signals that something deeper is at stake. When someone's emotional response seems disproportionate to the apparent content, there's usually additional meaning you're not seeing yet. Listening without defensive reactions is particularly important when people are critical or challenging. The natural human response to criticism is defensiveness, but defensiveness shuts down communication and prevents you from learning valuable information. Training yourself to stay open and curious even when receiving difficult feedback is one of the most powerful communication skills you can develop. When someone criticizes you or your ideas, resist the urge to defend, explain, or counterattack. Instead, ask questions to understand their perspective more fully. Thank them for sharing feedback that helps you improve. Look for the kernel of truth, even in criticism that seems unfair or exaggerated. This non-defensive stance doesn't mean accepting all criticism as valid. It means staying open long enough to understand the criticism fully before deciding how to respond. Listening with the intent to learn rather than to respond transforms every conversation into an opportunity for growth. When your primary goal is understanding rather than persuading, people sense this and open up more fully. Paradoxically, this approach often leads to more influence than directly trying to persuade because people feel genuinely heard and become more receptive to your perspective in return. Chapter 5: Crafting Messages That Resonate. Once you've listened deeply and understand your audience, the next step is crafting messages that connect with how people actually think and make decisions. The most influential communicators don't just speak their truth. They translate their truth into language and frames that resonate with their specific audience. Story structure is the most powerful framework for memorable communication. Human brains are wired to think in narrative terms. We remember stories far better than abstract arguments or lists of facts. We're emotionally engaged by stories in ways that dry information can't achieve. Every effective story follows a basic structure. There's a protagonist that the audience can identify with. There's a challenge or conflict that creates tension. There are obstacles and struggles that build engagement. There's a climax where something changes. And there's a resolution that provides satisfaction and meaning. When you're trying to influence someone, frame your message as a story rather than as an argument. Instead of listing reasons why they should adopt your proposal, tell the story of someone who faced a similar situation, struggled with the decision, chose a particular path, and experienced specific outcomes. Your audience should be able to see themselves in the protagonist of your story. This identification makes the story's lessons feel personally relevant, rather than abstract or applicable only to others. The challenges and obstacles in your story should mirror the real concerns your audience has. When they see their own fears and doubts reflected in the story, they become emotionally invested in how those challenges get resolved. The resolution should demonstrate the transformation that becomes possible when the protagonist makes the right choice. This transformation should be specific and believable, not exaggerated or fantastical. Concrete language creates clearer mental images than abstract language. Compare these two statements. Our solution improves efficiency versus our solution cuts processing time from 4 hours to 30 minutes. The second statement is far more powerful because it provides concrete, specific details that create a clear mental picture. Whenever possible, replace abstract concepts with concrete examples, specific numbers, and vivid details. Instead of saying this saves money, say this saves an average of $400 per month. Instead of saying people love this, say 92% of users report they would recommend this to a friend. Sensory language engages the brain more fully than purely conceptual language. When you incorporate details about how things look, sound, feel, smell, or taste, you activate more areas of the listener's brain and create more memorable, impactful messages. Instead of saying the office was unpleasant, say the office was cold, with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead and the chemical smell of fresh carpet making people's eyes water. The sensory details make the scene vivid and real. Analogies and metaphors help people understand new or complex ideas by connecting them to familiar concepts. When someone doesn't understand something, often the problem isn't that you haven't explained it clearly enough. The problem is that they don't have the right mental framework to receive the information. Analogies provide that framework by saying this new thing is like this familiar thing you already understand. The best analogies use concepts your audience is definitely familiar with and connect to your point in multiple ways, not just surface similarity. Einstein's explanation that space-time curvature is like a rubber sheet that bends when you place a heavy ball on it helped countless people understand relativity by connecting it to familiar physical experience. Repetition with variation reinforces key messages without becoming boring. People need to hear important ideas multiple times before they fully absorb them. But simple repetition quickly becomes tedious and causes people to tune out. The solution is to repeat your core message in different ways throughout your communication. State it directly once, then illustrate it with an example. Then present it as a question. Then connect it to a story. then reference it in passing. Each iteration reinforces the message while coming from a different angle that keeps the communication fresh. Rule of 3 is a pattern that appears throughout effective communication. Information presented in groups of 3 is more memorable and satisfying than information in groups of 2 or 4. 3 examples: 3 arguments, 3 benefits, 3 steps. This pattern shows up in effective speeches, memorable slogans, and powerful writing throughout history. The reason seems to be that 3 is the smallest number that establishes a pattern. 2 might be coincidence. 3 demonstrates a reliable pattern. But 4 or more starts to feel overwhelming. When you're organizing your message, look for ways to structure key elements in 3s. Contrast creates clarity and emphasis. When you present something in contrast to something else, the differences become more vivid, and the essential nature of each element becomes clearer. Political speeches often use contrast effectively. Where some people see obstacles, I see opportunities. Where others propose minor adjustments, we need fundamental transformation. Where they offer complexity and confusion, we provide clarity and direction. Each contrast sharpens the distinction between 2 options and makes your preferred option more appealing. Questions engage the audience's mind actively rather than keeping them in passive reception mode. When you make a statement, people can hear it passively. When you ask a question, their brains automatically begin searching for an answer, which means they're actively engaged with your content. Rhetorical questions don't require verbal answers, but prompt internal reflection. Have you ever felt frustrated trying to explain yourself and feeling misunderstood? This question causes listeners to search their own experience for relevant memories, which primes them to care about what comes next. Direct questions that do require answers create even more engagement, though they need to be used carefully to avoid putting people on the spot uncomfortably. The yes ladder is a technique where you structure a series of questions or statements that naturally elicit agreement, building momentum toward agreement with your main point. You start with statements that are obviously true and that your audience will definitely agree with. Then you make slightly less obvious statements that follow logically from the first ones. Then you introduce your actual proposal, which now feels like a natural extension of everything they've already agreed with. For example, you care about your team's success, right? And you want them to have the tools they need to do their best work. And when you invest in your team, you see returns in productivity and morale. So investing in this training program that gives them exactly those tools makes perfect sense. Each question builds on the previous one, creating momentum toward the conclusion. Pacing and leading is a technique borrowed from hypnosis, where you first match the other person's current state and then gradually lead them to a different state. In communication terms, this means first acknowledging and validating where someone currently is before trying to move them somewhere new. If someone is skeptical about your proposal, you don't immediately try to convince them. First, you acknowledge their skepticism. I understand why you'd be skeptical. A lot of similar programs have overpromised and underdelivered. You're right to be cautious. This pacing validates their current position and builds credibility. Then you lead. What makes this different is the specific, measurable outcomes we've documented across 15 implementations. Let me show you the data. By first matching where they are, you earn the right to lead them somewhere new. Inoculation involves addressing potential objections before your audience thinks of them. This technique is called inoculation because it works like a vaccine. You introduce a weakened form of the objection and refute it, which makes the audience resistant when they encounter stronger forms of that objection later. You might say, some people wonder whether this approach would work in a smaller organization. Great question. We've actually tested this in companies ranging from 5 employees to 5,000, and the principles scale effectively at any size. By raising and answering the objection yourself, you prevent it from festering as an unspoken concern that blocks acceptance. Call to action should be specific and achievable. Many messages fail at the final step because they inspire or convince people but don't tell them specifically what to do next. After all your effective communication, people should know exactly what action you want them to take and feel confident that they can take that action successfully. Instead of ending with vague suggestions like, think about what I've shared, or consider making some changes, end with specific, actionable requests. The next step is to schedule a 15-minute call this week to discuss implementation. I'll send you a calendar link right after this meeting. The specificity removes ambiguity and makes action more likely. Chapter 6. Handling conflict and difficult conversations. The most influential communicators don't avoid difficult conversations. They've developed the skills to navigate conflict constructively, turning potentially damaging interactions into opportunities for deeper understanding and stronger relationships. Most people handle conflict poorly because they've never learned effective strategies, and because the emotional intensity of conflict triggers reactive rather than strategic responses. The first principle of effective conflict navigation is separating the person from the problem. When conflict arises, the natural tendency is to focus on the other person as the source of the problem. They're being unreasonable. They're being difficult. They're not listening. But this person-focused framing makes resolution nearly impossible because it triggers defensiveness and escalation. Instead, frame conflicts as problems to be solved collaboratively. The challenge isn't defeating the other person. It's finding a solution that addresses everyone's core needs. When you approach conflict as a joint problem-solving exercise rather than as a battle, everything shifts. Your language changes from "you're wrong" to "here's a challenge we're facing together." Your goal changes from winning to finding mutually acceptable solutions. The other person becomes a partner in solving a shared problem rather than an adversary to defeat. Understanding the anatomy of conflict helps you intervene more effectively. Most conflicts involve several layers. At the surface are triggering events, the specific actions or statements that sparked the conflict. Beneath this are different goals and interests that create apparent incompatibility. Deeper still are often different values or beliefs about what matters or what's appropriate. At the deepest level are sometimes identity issues, where people feel their fundamental sense of self is being challenged or disrespected. Effective conflict resolution requires addressing the right level. Many conflicts persist because people argue at the surface level about specific events, while the real issues operate at deeper levels. If the true conflict is about different values, but you're arguing about specific incidents, you'll never reach resolution. Dig beneath surface disagreements to identify what's really at stake. Often what seems like a conflict about a specific decision is actually a conflict about power, respect, fairness, or competing priorities. When you identify and address these deeper issues, surface disagreements often resolve themselves. Interest-based negotiation focuses on underlying interests rather than stated positions. Positions are what people say they want. Interests are why they want it. The classic example involves two people arguing over an orange. Their positions are incompatible because they both want the orange. But when you explore interests, you discover one person wants to eat the fruit while the other wants the peel for baking. Once you understand interests, you can find solutions that satisfy both parties. In every conflict, spend time exploring interests before proposing solutions. Ask why a particular outcome matters to the other person. Ask what they're trying to accomplish or protect. Ask what concerns they have about alternative approaches. Often apparent conflicts dissolve when you discover that different proposals actually serve compatible interests and can be combined or sequenced. De-escalation techniques prevent conflicts from spiraling into destructive territory. When emotions run high, people say things they don't mean and damage relationships unnecessarily. Recognizing escalation patterns and having strategies to interrupt them is crucial. Common escalation patterns include raising voices, using absolute language like always and never, bringing up past grievances unrelated to the current issue, personal attacks, and ultimatums. When you notice these patterns, either in yourself or others, pause the conversation before more damage occurs. One effective de-escalation technique is the tactical pause. When conflict intensifies, one person suggests taking a break to cool down before continuing. This isn't avoidance. It's strategic, emotional management. I can feel this getting heated. Let's take 15 minutes to cool down and then come back to find a solution. This pause allows the nervous system to return to baseline and restores access to higher level thinking. Another technique is lowering your voice volume and slowing your pace. When the other person is loud and fast, the instinct is to match their intensity, but this creates escalation. Instead, consciously speak more quietly and slowly. This often causes the other person to unconsciously match your calmer pattern. Acknowledging emotions validates them without necessarily agreeing with the content. When someone is angry or upset, they need to feel heard before they can move forward. You might say, "I can see this is really frustrating for you." This simple acknowledgement doesn't mean you agree with their position. It just means you recognize their emotional experience, which helps them feel understood. Finding common ground reminds both parties that despite disagreement on this issue, you share other values or goals. Even in serious conflicts, there's usually something both parties agree on. Identifying and explicitly stating this common ground creates a foundation for working through disagreements. We both want what's best for the team. We both care about quality. We both value honesty in our communication. These statements of shared values or goals remind everyone that you're not enemies. You're people with a shared purpose, working through a disagreement about how to achieve that purpose. Reframing conflict from zero-sum to positive-sum changes the entire dynamic. Many people unconsciously approach conflicts believing that one person's gain must be another's loss. But most situations actually offer opportunities for mutual gain if you're creative about identifying them. Instead of fighting over a fixed pie, look for ways to expand the pie or to divide it in ways where everyone gets what matters most to them. This requires understanding priorities. What each party cares about most might be different, which creates opportunities for trades where everyone wins. You might care most about timeline, while the other person cares most about budget. By finding solutions that optimize both priorities through creative structuring, you create better outcomes than either party could achieve through pure position-based bargaining. Apology is a powerful tool that most people use ineffectively. A genuine apology can de-escalate conflict, rebuild trust, and move relationships forward. But most apologies fail because they're defensive, incomplete, or insincere. Effective apologies have several components. They acknowledge the specific behavior and its impact. I recognize that when I missed that deadline, it created problems for your project and made you question my reliability. They take responsibility without excuses or justifications. That was my mistake, and I should have communicated with you sooner when I realized I was behind schedule. They express genuine remorse. I'm truly sorry for letting you down. They include a commitment to different behavior in the future. Going forward, I'll flag any potential delays immediately so we can adjust plans before problems occur. And sometimes they include efforts to make amends. What can I do to help get your project back on track? Half apologies that include the word, but actually make conflicts worse. I'm sorry, but you were also wrong, is not an apology. It's a continuation of the conflict. Same with, I'm sorry you felt that way, which doesn't take responsibility for your behavior, only for the other person's reaction. Boundaries need to be clearly stated and maintained during conflict. While you should generally be flexible and collaborative, there are limits to what's acceptable in how conflicts are conducted. Disrespect, personal attacks, threats, and manipulation cross lines that need to be clearly enforced. When someone violates reasonable boundaries, calmly but firmly identify the violation and the consequence. I'm willing to continue this conversation, but not if we're going to resort to personal attacks. If we can focus on the actual issues, I'm happy to keep talking. If not, we'll need to pause until we can discuss this respectfully. This isn't about controlling the other person. It's about clearly stating what you will and won't participate in. Follow through on stated consequences is essential. If you say you'll end the conversation if certain behaviors continue, and then those behaviors continue, you must follow through. Otherwise, your boundaries become empty threats that encourage more boundary violations. After conflicts resolve, explicitly rebuild the relationship. Conflicts create distance and damage even when they end with agreements. Taking time to explicitly reconnect prevents lingering resentment from poisoning future interactions. This might involve acknowledging that the conflict was difficult, but you value the relationship and want to move forward positively. It might involve some low-stakes positive interactions that rebuild comfort and trust. It might involve explicitly stating that you're not holding grudges about what was said during the heat of conflict. The goal is ensuring that resolved conflicts actually close rather than remaining as open wounds that get infected during future disagreements. Chapter 7. Building Trust and Credibility Rapidly. Trust is the foundation of all influence. Without trust, even the most logical arguments and compelling stories fail to persuade. But trust typically builds slowly over time through repeated positive interactions. Master communicators have learned how to accelerate trust building while maintaining authenticity and earning that trust legitimately. The components of trust are well established through research. Competence means people believe you have the knowledge, skills, and ability to do what you claim. Reliability means people believe you'll follow through on commitments and behave consistently. Integrity means people believe you'll be honest and act according to stated values. Benevolence means people believe you care about their interests, not just your own. All four components must be present for deep trust to develop. Strength in one area doesn't fully compensate for weakness in another. You might be highly competent, but if people doubt your integrity, trust remains low. You might have great intentions, but if you're unreliable, trust erodes. Demonstrating competence begins with showing rather than telling. Anyone can claim expertise, but demonstrated knowledge and skill are far more convincing. When you share insights that reveal deep understanding, make accurate predictions, or solve problems others couldn't solve, you build credible evidence of competence. Strategic vulnerability involves selectively sharing appropriate struggles and uncertainties rather than projecting false perfection. Paradoxically, admitting what you don't know often builds more credibility than claiming omniscience. When you say, "I don't have expertise in that specific area, but here's what I do know, and here's how we could find the answer," you demonstrate both honest self-awareness and problem-solving ability. This combination builds more trust than pretending to know everything. Reliability is built through consistent follow-through on commitments, especially small commitments. When you say you'll send an email by tomorrow, and you do it, you make a small deposit in the trust bank. When you consistently do what you say you'll do, even in minor matters, people generalize this reliability to more important domains. The inverse is also true. Unreliability in small matters creates doubt about reliability in larger matters. If you're consistently late to meetings or slow to respond to messages, people unconsciously assume you'll also be unreliable about important commitments. Underpromise and overdeliver is a classic reliability building strategy. When you set conservative expectations and then exceed them, you create positive surprises that build trust. When you set aggressive expectations and fail to meet them, even if your actual performance was good, you create disappointment that erodes trust. This doesn't mean being pessimistic or lowering standards. It means being realistic about what you can commit to and then working to exceed those commitments. Integrity is demonstrated through alignment between words and actions. People watch to see if you actually do what you say you believe in. They notice when you hold yourself to the same standards you hold others to. They observe whether you maintain your principles when it's convenient or only when it's easy. Small integrity tests happen constantly in daily interactions. Do you keep confidences that people share with you? Do you give credit to others for their contributions? Do you admit your mistakes? Do you tell the truth even when lies would be more convenient? Each of these moments either builds or erodes trust. Transparency accelerates trust building by reducing uncertainty. When people understand your thinking, motivations, and constraints, they can predict your behavior more accurately, which increases comfort and trust. This doesn't mean sharing every thought or eliminating all privacy. It means being appropriately open about relevant information. In business contexts, transparency might mean explaining the reasoning behind decisions, sharing constraints you're operating under, or being honest about what you can and cannot commit to. Leaders who explain why they made particular choices build more trust than leaders who simply announce decisions without context. Benevolence is communicated through genuine interest in others' welfare and success. This isn't about self-sacrifice. It's about approaching interactions with a genuine desire to create mutual value rather than extracting value at others' expense. Small acts of generosity build benevolence perceptions, sharing useful information with no expectation of return, making introductions that benefit others, offering help when you see someone struggling. These gestures signal that you care about more than just your own interests. Active support during difficult times builds deep trust. When someone is struggling and you offer genuine help without being asked and without expecting repayment, you demonstrate benevolence in ways that create lasting bonds. Conversely, people never forget being abandoned during times of need. Consistency across contexts is crucial for trust. People need to see that you're reliable, not just when it's convenient or when you need something, but consistently across situations and over time. This is why character matters more than charisma for long-term influence. Charisma can create immediate positive impressions, but consistent character builds the deep trust that enables lasting influence. Admitting mistakes quickly and completely demonstrates integrity and builds trust, even though it might seem counterintuitive. When something goes wrong and you immediately take responsibility, apologize sincerely, and focus on solutions, you actually build credibility. Everyone makes mistakes. The question is how you handle them. People who try to hide mistakes, shift blame, or minimize problems lose trust rapidly. People who own mistakes and work to fix them are seen as trustworthy precisely because they demonstrated integrity under pressure. Honoring commitments, even when circumstances change, shows reliability. It's easy to keep commitments when everything goes smoothly. The real test comes when keeping commitments becomes difficult or inconvenient. When you follow through despite obstacles, you send a powerful message about your reliability. If you truly cannot honor a commitment, communicate this as early as possible, explain what changed, apologize for the impact, and work to minimize negative consequences. This approach maintains trust even when you can't deliver exactly what was promised. Giving credit generously builds trust and goodwill. When you acknowledge others' contributions, celebrate their successes, and share credit for collaborative achievements, you signal benevolence and secure self-confidence. Insecure people hoard credit. Secure, trustworthy people share it freely. This generosity creates reciprocal goodwill and builds your reputation as someone who elevates others rather than diminishing them to make yourself look better. Asking for advice can counterintuitively build credibility. When you ask someone for their expert opinion, you implicitly acknowledge their competence, which they appreciate. But you also demonstrate your own good judgment in knowing who to consult. Your intellectual humility in recognizing you don't have all answers, and your commitment to making well-informed decisions. Obviously, this only works if you genuinely value and consider the advice. Asking for advice, you ignore damages rather than builds trust. Personal disclosure, when appropriate, builds connection and trust by showing authenticity. This doesn't mean oversharing or being inappropriately personal in professional contexts. It means being willing to show your humanity rather than maintaining a perfect professional facade. Sharing relevant personal experiences, acknowledging emotions when appropriate, and letting people see you as a whole person rather than just a role creates warmth that facilitates trust. The key is matching disclosure to context and relationship depth. Early in relationships, disclosure should be relatively surface level and professional. As relationships develop, more personal sharing becomes appropriate. Competence in their domain matters to your audience. If you're trying to influence people about marketing strategy, demonstrating marketing competence matters far more than demonstrating competence in unrelated areas. Make sure you're building credibility in the dimensions that actually matter to your audience and objectives. Social proof from trusted sources accelerates trust building. When people, your audience, already trusts vouch for you, that trust transfers partially to you. This is why testimonials, references, and introductions from mutual connections are so valuable. Strategic networking focuses not just on meeting many people, but on building deep trust with key connectors whose endorsement will open doors with entire networks of people. Long-term trust requires ongoing investment. Trust isn't a one-time achievement. It's built through consistent positive experiences and can be damaged quickly through negative ones. Think of trust as a bank account, where deposits must exceed withdrawals over time. Every kept promise is a deposit. Every demonstration of competence, integrity, or benevolence is a deposit. Every broken commitment or selfish action is a withdrawal. Maintain positive balance through consistent, trustworthy behavior. Chapter 8. Adapting your communication style. Different people process information differently, make decisions differently, and respond to different communication approaches. Influential communicators develop flexibility to adapt their style to match their audience while maintaining authenticity. Communication styles can be understood along several dimensions. Some people are more direct and explicit, while others prefer indirect and implicit communication. Some people are highly expressive and emotional, while others are more reserved and analytical. Some people focus on big picture vision, while others need detailed specifics. Some people make decisions quickly based on intuition, while others require extensive analysis and time. None of these styles is inherently better or worse. They're simply different approaches that work for different people in different contexts. The challenge is recognizing which style your audience prefers and adapting appropriately. The direct versus indirect dimension involves how explicitly you state your main points and requests. Direct communicators appreciate clarity and efficiency. They want you to state your conclusion up front, make explicit requests, and avoid ambiguity. With direct communicators, lead with your bottom line. Be clear about what you're asking for, and don't bury important information in lengthy preambles. Indirect communicators prefer more context and subtlety. They want to understand the background and reasoning before hearing conclusions. They may find overly direct approaches pushy or aggressive. With indirect communicators, provide context before conclusions, allow time for discussion and questions, and frame requests as invitations to collaborate rather than demands. Cultural background often influences preferences along this dimension. Many Western cultures value directness, while many Asian cultures prefer indirectness. But individual variation exists within all cultures, so pay attention to individual preferences rather than relying solely on cultural generalizations. The expressive versus reserved dimension involves how much emotion is displayed and discussed. Expressive communicators show emotions openly, appreciate when others do the same, and connect through emotional sharing. They value enthusiasm, passion, and personal connection. With expressive communicators, show appropriate emotion, use more animated delivery, share personal stories, and acknowledge emotional dimensions of situations. Reserved communicators prefer maintaining emotional control. value calm rationality, and may be uncomfortable with strong emotional displays. They prefer focusing on facts and logic rather than feelings. With reserved communicators, maintain more measured delivery, focus on logical arguments and evidence, minimize emotional appeals, and respect their privacy boundaries. The big picture versus detail-oriented dimension involves level of abstraction. Big picture thinkers focus on overall concepts, patterns, and strategic direction. They become impatient with excessive detail and want to understand the high-level vision. With big picture thinkers, start with the overall concept, explain the why before the how, use analogies and frameworks, and keep detailed specifics available, but don't lead with them. Detail-oriented thinkers want specifics, concrete examples, and step-by-step explanations. They become uncomfortable with vague generalities and need to understand exactly how things will work. With detail-oriented thinkers, provide specific examples, show concrete evidence, explain processes step by step, and be prepared with detailed information. The quick versus deliberate decision-making dimension involves pace and process. Quick decision-makers rely heavily on intuition, become frustrated with excessive analysis, and value speed and decisiveness. They're comfortable with uncertainty and willing to adjust course if initial decisions prove wrong. With quick decision-makers, present information concisely. Be prepared to make decisions in the moment. Emphasize that adjustments are possible and avoid analysis paralysis. Deliberate decision-makers need time to process information, consult with others, and think through implications. They become uncomfortable with pressure to decide quickly and may make poor choices when rushed. With deliberate decision-makers, provide information well in advance, allow time for consideration, expect multiple rounds of discussion, and be patient with their process. Recognizing someone's style requires observation and sometimes direct inquiry. Watch how they communicate with others. Notice what kinds of messages they seem to respond to positively. Pay attention to what frustrates them. You can also ask directly about preferences. How do you prefer to receive information about new proposals? Do you like to see all the details or just the high-level overview first? Would you like time to think about this? Or should we work through it together now? Most people appreciate being asked about their preferences rather than having someone assume. Flexibility doesn't mean being inauthentic or becoming a chameleon with no consistent identity. It means expressing your authentic self in ways that your audience can most easily receive. If you're naturally expressive, but communicating with reserved people, you don't have to become an emotionless robot. You just dial back your expressiveness to a level that makes them comfortable. If you're naturally detail-oriented, but communicating with big-picture thinkers, you don't have to eliminate details. You just start with the big picture and offer to dive into details if they want more information. Some situations require working with multiple people who have different styles simultaneously. In group settings, you can sequence your communication to address different styles. Start with big picture overview for strategic thinkers, then dive into details for analytical thinkers. Provide written materials that people can review at their own pace while also having verbal discussion for those who process better through conversation. Style mismatches often explain why communication fails even when the content is sound. If you're providing detailed analysis to someone who wants high-level vision, they'll tune out no matter how good your analysis is. If you're being indirect with someone who values directness, they'll become frustrated by what they perceive as your inability to get to the point. Recognizing and bridging these style gaps dramatically improves communication effectiveness. Meta communication means talking about how you're communicating. When you sense a style mismatch creating problems, sometimes the solution is explicitly discussing communication preferences. I notice I've been diving deep into details, but I'm not sure that's what you need. Would you prefer if I step back and explain the overall approach first? This kind of explicit check-in prevents miscommunication and shows respect for the other person's preferences. Written versus verbal preferences also matter. Some people process information better in writing, where they can review it at their own pace and reference it later. Others strongly prefer verbal discussion, where they can ask questions and think out loud. Providing information in the format someone prefers dramatically increases the chances they'll engage with and retain it. For important communications, consider providing information in multiple formats. Send a written document people can review, then have a verbal conversation to discuss questions and implications. This approach serves both written and verbal processors. Energy matching involves calibrating your energy level to the situation and audience. If someone is calm and measured, coming in with high energy can feel jarring and off-putting. If someone is energized and enthusiastic, responding with low energy can seem dismissive or depressed. This doesn't mean being fake. It means being thoughtful about meeting people where they are energetically. Humor usage varies dramatically across styles and cultures. Some people appreciate humor in professional settings and see it as building rapport. Others view humor as unprofessional or distracting. Some types of humor work across most contexts, while other types are risky. Self-deprecating humor often builds warmth without offending, while humor at others' expense creates risk of damage. Pay attention to whether your audience appreciates humor and adjust accordingly. Formality levels should match context and relationship. Early in professional relationships, more formal communication is typically safer. As relationships develop and you understand someone's style, you can adjust toward more or less formality based on their preferences. Some people maintain formal professional communication even in long-term relationships, while others quickly shift to casual, friendly interaction. Follow their lead rather than imposing your preferred style. Age and generational factors can influence communication preferences, though individual variation is significant. Older professionals often prefer more formal communication and may have different technology preferences. Younger professionals often prefer more casual communication and may expect quicker response times via different channels. But these are tendencies, not rules. Pay attention to individual preferences rather than relying on stereotypes. The ultimate goal of style flexibility is making your audience comfortable enough to actually hear your message. When people feel comfortable with how you're communicating, they can focus on what you're communicating. When they're uncomfortable with style, the style itself becomes a barrier that prevents your content from landing effectively. Chapter 9: Influencing Groups and Managing Group Dynamics. Influencing individuals is different from influencing groups. Group dynamics create entirely new challenges and opportunities that require different approaches. Understanding how groups function allows you to communicate more effectively in meetings, presentations, and any context involving multiple people. Group polarization is a phenomenon where groups tend to move toward more extreme positions than individual members initially held. When people with similar views discuss an issue, they tend to reinforce each other's positions and shift toward more extreme versions of their initial stance. This happens because people hear new arguments supporting their view. They want to distinguish themselves as strong supporters of the group position, and they perceive the group consensus as validating their view. For communicators, this means that winning over one or two influential group members can create momentum where others follow and even amplify the position. But it also means that groups can shift away from your position if key influencers oppose it and others reinforce that opposition. Social loafing occurs when people exert less effort in group settings than they would individually, because responsibility is diffused across the group. In communication contexts, this means people in meetings often engage less actively than they would in one-on-one conversations. Combat social loafing by creating individual accountability within groups. Ask specific people for their input by name. Assign specific responsibilities. Make it clear that everyone's contribution matters. Groupthink is a dangerous dynamic where desire for harmony and consensus prevents critical evaluation of ideas. When groupthink takes hold, dissenting opinions get suppressed, alternatives aren't fully explored, and groups make poor decisions despite having access to information that should prevent those mistakes. Warning signs of groupthink include illusions of invulnerability, where the group becomes overconfident, collective rationalization, where warning signs are explained away, belief in inherent group morality, stereotyping of outsiders, pressure on dissenters to conform, self-censorship, where people suppress their own doubts, and illusions of unanimity, where silence is interpreted as agreement. Prevent groupthink by explicitly valuing dissent, assigning someone to play devil's advocate, breaking into smaller subgroups that develop independent positions before rejoining, and seeking input from outsiders who aren't invested in the group's preferred position. Status hierarchies within groups profoundly affect communication patterns. High-status members speak more, get more attention, and have more influence over group decisions regardless of whether their ideas are actually better. Low-status members speak less, are interrupted more often, and have their ideas dismissed more readily. If you're communicating to a group, identify the status hierarchy and ensure you address high-status members' concerns while also drawing out input from lower-status members who might have valuable perspectives but are hesitant to share. If you're lower status in a group, strategic alliance with higher status members can amplify your influence. When a high-status member endorses or builds on your idea, the group pays more attention than when you present the same idea alone. Coalition building involves identifying allies before group discussions and coordinating positions. When multiple people support the same position, it gains credibility and momentum. Before important meetings, connect individually with people whose support would be valuable. Understand their concerns, and see if you can find common ground. Then during the group discussion, these allies can reinforce your points and create the appearance of broad support. Sequential persuasion in groups means winning people over one at a time rather than trying to persuade everyone simultaneously. Each person who becomes convinced becomes a messenger to others. Start with the most persuadable people and those with most influence. As they come on board, they help persuade the next tier. Trying to convince everyone at once often fails because you lack the credibility and social proof that comes from visible support. Presentation sequencing in group settings matters enormously. The first position presented becomes an anchor that shapes evaluation of all subsequent positions. If you present first, make your position strong and comprehensive because it will serve as the reference point. If others present first, their position becomes the anchor you must dislodge. When you control the agenda, position your proposals strategically. When you don't control the agenda, be prepared to reframe the discussion rather than simply reacting to the anchor others have set. Room dynamics and physical arrangement affect communication effectiveness. The person at the head of a conference table is automatically perceived as having more authority. People sitting near each other tend to align their positions. People across from each other often take opposing positions. If possible, arrange seating strategically. Sit next to people you want to align with. Position yourself near high-status members to increase your status by association. Avoid arrangements that physically position you in opposition to people you're trying to persuade. Energy management in groups involves recognizing that group energy fluctuates and timing your most important points for moments of peak attention. Early in meetings, people are fresh but may not yet be engaged. Middle segments often see declining attention as people become fatigued or distracted. Final segments can have renewed attention as people anticipate conclusion. Schedule the most important and complex discussions for early to middle meeting segments when energy is good. Use later segments for simpler discussions or wrap-up. Manage group energy through pace variation, strategic breaks, and engaging activities that re-energize attention. Addressing the room means speaking to the entire group while making eye contact with individuals. Many presenters make the mistake of directing remarks primarily to the highest status person in the room or to the person asking questions, but other group members notice when they're ignored and become less engaged. Systematically make eye contact with everyone in the room. Direct some remarks to different sections of the group. This inclusive approach keeps everyone engaged and prevents informal hierarchy where some people feel valued and others feel dismissed. Managing questions in group settings requires balancing the individual asking with the needs of the group. When someone asks a question, briefly answer it, but then connect your answer to broader themes that interest everyone. If a question is highly specific to one person's situation and not relevant to others, offer to discuss it separately after the meeting so you don't lose the group's attention. Handling opposition in groups is different from handling it one-on-one because you have an audience watching the interaction. Becoming defensive or aggressive in response to challenges damages your credibility with everyone watching. Thank people for raising concerns, acknowledge valid points, address the substance thoughtfully, and maintain composure regardless of the tone used by the challenger. This demonstrates confidence and reasonableness that impresses the audience even if you don't win over the specific challenger. Building on others' ideas shows collaborative spirit and helps create positive group dynamics. When someone suggests something, find aspects you agree with and build on those rather than immediately pointing out flaws. Yes, and rather than yes, but keeps positive momentum. This doesn't mean accepting bad ideas. It means framing your contributions as additions and refinements rather than rejections. Silent members often have valuable input they're hesitant to share. Explicitly invite their participation in non-threatening ways. You've been quiet, but I'd really value your perspective on this. Give them permission to pass if they're not ready, but create openings for them to contribute. Often, the quietest people have the most thoughtful observations because they've been listening carefully while others talked. Summarizing periodically helps groups track complex discussions and builds toward consensus. Every 10 or 15 minutes in long discussions, pause and summarize the key points raised, areas of agreement, and remaining questions. This helps prevent discussions from circling endlessly and gives people a chance to course correct if the group is going off track. Decision-making processes should be explicitly defined rather than assumed. Is this a democratic vote? Consensus decision? Input for a leader who will ultimately decide? When the process isn't clear, people become frustrated and feel manipulated. State up front how the decision will be made, ensure everyone understands the process, and follow that process consistently. Chapter 10. The Power of Questions. Questions are among the most powerful communication tools available, yet most people dramatically underutilize them. Strategic questions can accomplish goals that direct statements cannot. They engage thinking, uncover information, challenge assumptions, build ownership, and guide conversations while maintaining collaborative rather than combative dynamics. The Socratic method demonstrates the power of questions to develop understanding. Rather than telling students the answers, Socratic teachers ask sequences of questions that lead students to discover answers themselves. This approach creates deeper learning and stronger ownership because people believe their own conclusions more than they believe information simply told to them. In influence contexts, the same principle applies. When you tell someone something, they can accept or reject it. When you ask questions that lead them to conclude the same thing themselves, they become convinced through their own reasoning. This creates much stronger commitment than external persuasion. Open-ended questions invite expansive responses and exploration. Questions that begin with what, how, or tell me about cannot be answered with simple yes or no. They require the respondent to think, formulate ideas, and provide substantive responses. What are your main concerns about this approach? How do you see this affecting your team? Tell me about what's worked well in the past. Each of these questions invites detailed responses that provide valuable information and engage the respondent's thinking. Closed questions can be answered with yes or no. They're useful for confirming specific facts or moving toward decisions, but don't promote exploration or discussion. Do you support this proposal? Will that timeline work? Have you seen this before? These questions serve purposes, but should be balanced with open questions that create richer dialogue. Clarifying questions demonstrate engagement and ensure accurate understanding. When something is unclear or ambiguous, asking for clarification shows you're paying attention and prevents misunderstandings from compounding. What exactly do you mean by that? Can you give me an example? How would that work in practice? These questions help both parties develop shared understanding. Probing questions help people explore their own thinking more deeply. These questions don't challenge or interrogate. They invite reflection and development of ideas. What leads you to that conclusion? What assumptions are we making? What would need to be true for that to work? If we solved that problem, what would change? These questions help people think more carefully about positions they might have formed quickly or based on limited consideration. Hypothetical questions allow exploration of possibilities without commitment. What if we approach this completely differently? Suppose we had unlimited budget. What would you do? If this fails, what would be the consequences? These questions open up thinking and help people consider options they might not have thought of when constrained by current reality. Reflective questions turn statements into questions that encourage the other person to elaborate. Someone says this project is impossible. Instead of arguing, you might ask, what makes it seem impossible? This invites them to explain their reasoning, which gives you better understanding of their concerns and often helps them realize their initial statement was too extreme. Comparative questions help people evaluate options and clarify priorities. How does this compare to what you're currently doing? What's more important, speed or quality? Which concerns you more, the cost or the complexity? These questions help people make explicit judgments they might have only considered vaguely. Future-oriented questions help people envision outcomes and consequences. Where do you want to be in a year? What will success look like? How will you know if this is working? If we implement this, what happens next? These questions shift attention from current problems to future possibilities, which can reduce resistance and build motivation. Problem-focused questions versus solution-focused questions create very different conversational dynamics. Problem-focused questions keep attention on difficulties. Why isn't this working? What's blocking progress? Who is responsible for this failure? While sometimes necessary, excessive problem focus can create negative spirals where people feel stuck. Solution-focused questions shift attention to possibilities and paths forward. What's already working that we could do more of? What would the first small step forward look like? Who has dealt with similar challenges successfully? These questions maintain acknowledgement of problems while directing energy towards solutions. Assumptive questions embed assumptions within the question structure. When will you implement this? Assumes the person will implement it. The question isn't whether, but when. How much budget should we allocate? Assumes budget will be allocated. The question is, how much? These questions can be powerful influence tools because they subtly presuppose certain outcomes. But they must be used carefully because if the assumptions are premature or unwelcome, people will resist the embedded presumption. Challenging questions push people to reconsider positions or justify their thinking. These can be valuable for stress testing ideas, but must be delivered with care to avoid creating defensiveness. What evidence supports that belief? Have we considered alternative explanations? What would convince you that you're wrong? How do you account for this contradictory information? Tone is critical with challenging questions. Delivered with genuine curiosity, they promote productive thinking. Delivered with skepticism or judgment, they create defensiveness and shut down dialogue. Permission questions ask if it's okay to proceed with something, which paradoxically often makes people more open. Would you be willing to consider a different perspective? Can I share what I've seen in similar situations? May I ask why you believe that? These questions respect the other person's autonomy while opening doors you want to walk through. Most people say yes to permission questions because saying no would seem closed-minded or defensive. Silence after questions is crucial. Many people ask a question and then immediately start talking again, either by elaborating on the question, offering potential answers, or asking another question. This defeats the purpose of asking. When you ask a question, stop talking and wait for the response. Count to 10 silently if you need to. Give the other person space to think and formulate their response. Often, the most valuable insights come after several seconds of silence as the person accesses deeper thoughts. Question sequences create progressive understanding or movement. Start with easier, less threatening questions and progress toward more challenging or personal questions as comfort builds. Begin with questions about external situations and move gradually toward questions about the person's own beliefs, feelings, or actions. The funnel approach starts with broad, open questions and progressively narrows to more specific questions. Tell me about the situation. What aspects concern you most? What have you already tried? What happened when you tried that? What would you do differently next time? Each question builds on the previous response and narrows focus. The reverse funnel starts with specific questions and broadens to larger patterns or principles. This works well when someone is stuck on a specific problem and needs to see it in broader context. Questions to yourself can be voiced aloud to model productive thinking. I'm wondering what we're not seeing here. I'm asking myself whether we're solving the right problem. This explicit metacognitive processing shows your thinking process and often encourages others to engage in similar reflection. Avoiding leading questions is important when you genuinely want to understand the other person's views, rather than merely confirming your own. Leading questions contain the answer you want within the question itself. Don't you think this is the best approach? Implies you believe it's best and pressures them to agree. A non-leading alternative would be, what do you think about this approach? The first question is manipulative. The second is genuinely curious. Questions, instead of statements, often communicate more effectively. Instead of saying you're not seeing the bigger picture, you might ask, what's the bigger context we should consider? Instead of saying, that won't work, you might ask, what challenges do you foresee with that approach? The question form is less threatening and more likely to be received openly. Appreciative inquiry focuses questions on what's working, what's possible, and what's desired, rather than only on problems and deficits. When was this working well? What made that possible? What would it look like if this were working optimally? What strengths can we build on? This approach doesn't ignore problems, but frames them within a more constructive context of building on strengths toward desired futures. Chapter 11. Mastering Nonverbal Communication. While words carry explicit content, nonverbal communication carries the emotional truth and relational meaning of interactions. Research consistently shows that when verbal and nonverbal messages conflict, people believe the nonverbal signals. Mastering nonverbal communication means both reading others accurately and managing your own signals strategically. Body language operates largely outside conscious awareness for both sender and receiver. This means people often communicate things non-verbally they wouldn't say verbally, and people pick up on these signals without consciously recognizing what they're responding to. Someone might verbally agree with your proposal while their body language screams discomfort. If you only attend to their words, you miss the resistance that will sabotage implementation. If you notice and address the nonverbal signals, you can surface and resolve the real concerns. Posture communicates power, confidence, and engagement. Open postures with uncrossed limbs and exposed torso signal confidence and receptivity. Closed postures with crossed arms and legs signal defensiveness or discomfort. Expansive postures that take up more space signal dominance and confidence. Contracted postures that minimize space signal submission or low confidence. Standing tall with shoulders back and head up communicates confidence and authority. Slumped posture with rounded shoulders communicates low confidence or defeat. In professional contexts, maintaining confident posture, even when you don't feel confident internally, actually helps you become more confident. The body affects the mind as much as the mind affects the body. Research on power posing shows that holding confident physical positions for even 2 minutes changes hormone levels, increasing testosterone and decreasing cortisol in ways that make you feel and act more confidently. Mirroring occurs when people unconsciously adopt similar postures and gestures to those they're interacting with. This natural phenomenon increases rapport and comfort. When rapport is strong, mirroring happens automatically. You can also use mirroring strategically to build rapport by subtly matching the other person's posture, gestures, and energy level. The key word is subtly. Obvious mimicry feels mocking and damages rapport. Natural matching that happens with a slight delay feels comfortable and builds connection. Match their energy level, their pace of movement, whether they're leaning forward or back, how much space they're taking up, and their overall openness or closedness. Gestures should align with and emphasize your message. Hand movements that illustrate concepts make abstract ideas more concrete and memorable. Pointing emphasizes specific items. Expanding gestures suggest growth or breadth. Contracting gestures suggest focus or precision. However, excessive gesturing can be distracting. And nervous gestures, like fidgeting, touching your face repeatedly, or playing with objects, signal anxiety and undermine credibility. The goal is purposeful gestures that support your message, not random movements driven by nervous energy. Facial expressions are the most information-rich nonverbal channel. Humans can produce thousands of distinct facial expressions, and we're neurologically wired to read faces from birth. The 7 universal emotions expressed facially across all cultures are happiness, sadness, anger, fear, disgust, surprise, and contempt. Each has characteristic patterns. Genuine smiles engage muscles around the eyes, creating crow's feet, while fake smiles only engage the mouth. Sadness shows in lowered eyebrows, drooping eyelids, and downturned mouth corners. Anger shows in lowered brows, tightened eyelids, and pressed lips. Fear widens the eyes and slightly opens the mouth. Your facial expressions should match your message. Smiling while delivering serious bad news creates incongruence that makes people distrust your sincerity. Maintaining stern expression while offering praise diminishes its impact. Conscious control over your facial expressions helps ensure your face supports rather than contradicts your intended message. Micro-expressions are brief facial expressions lasting less than half a second that reveal true emotions someone might be trying to conceal. These flickers are nearly impossible to fake and appear even when people are consciously trying to maintain neutral expressions. Learning to spot micro-expressions takes training, but even basic awareness helps you notice when someone's expressed emotion doesn't match their underlying state. When you see a flash of fear, anger, or disgust that's quickly suppressed, you've gained valuable information about the person's true reaction. Eye contact serves multiple functions in communication. In most Western cultures, appropriate eye contact signals confidence, honesty, and engagement. Avoiding eye contact often signals discomfort, deception, or submission. However, constant unbroken staring feels aggressive and uncomfortable. Natural eye contact involves looking at someone's eyes for 3 to 5 seconds, then briefly looking away before returning. This rhythm feels comfortable and engaged without being intense. When speaking to groups, systematically make eye contact with different individuals rather than staring at one person or looking over everyone's heads. This makes each person feel included and maintains engagement. Cultural norms around eye contact vary significantly. In some Asian and Latin American cultures, prolonged direct eye contact with authority figures is considered disrespectful. In Middle Eastern cultures, same-gender eye contact is more intense and prolonged than typical Western patterns. Adjust your eye contact patterns based on cultural context and individual comfort. Pupil dilation happens unconsciously in response to interest and arousal. When people are engaged and interested, pupils dilate. When bored or repelled, pupils contract. You can't consciously control this, which makes it a reliable signal. While you probably won't notice subtle pupil changes in normal conversation, being aware that this signal exists helps you understand why some people seem more or less engaged than their words suggest. Proximity and personal space communicate relationship and comfort. Different cultures have different comfortable distances, but within any culture, the distance people maintain reveals relationship dynamics. Intimate distance, from touching to about 18 inches, is reserved for romantic partners and very close relationships. Personal distance, from 18 inches to about 4 feet, is appropriate for friends and comfortable colleagues. Social distance, from 4 to 12 feet, is typical for professional interactions and acquaintances. Public distance, beyond 12 feet, is for formal presentations and public speaking. When someone consistently maintains more distance from you than from others, this suggests discomfort or desire for boundaries in your relationship. When someone moves closer, they're signaling comfort and desire for connection. Respect people's space preferences while being aware of what those preferences communicate. Touch is the most intimate form of nonverbal communication and must be used with great cultural and contextual sensitivity. In professional Western contexts, handshakes are standard greeting touch. Brief touches on the arm or shoulder can build rapport when done appropriately. But touch that feels invasive or inappropriate damages trust and can constitute harassment. General guidelines: touch only on socially acceptable areas like hands, arms, and shoulders, never areas that could be seen as intimate. Keep touches brief. Be especially cautious with touch across gender lines in professional settings. Pay attention to whether the other person seems comfortable or uncomfortable with touch and adjust accordingly. Some cultures and individuals are very comfortable with touch, while others find it invasive. Vocal tone carries as much meaning as words themselves. The same sentence can communicate completely different messages depending on vocal qualities. Volume, pitch, pace, and intonation all shape meaning. Confident communication typically involves moderate volume, neither too quiet nor too loud. Pitch that's steady rather than rising at the end of statements. Moderate pace that's neither rushed nor dragging. Clear articulation without mumbling. Rising intonation at the end of statements makes them sound like questions, suggesting uncertainty. This uptalk pattern, common especially among young women, undermines perceived confidence even when the speaker is actually confident about the content. Pace variation maintains engagement better than monotone pace. Slow down for important points to let them sink in. Speed up slightly for less critical information. Pause before and after key statements to create emphasis. These pace variations make your communication more dynamic and help important points stand out. Vocal fry, the creaky low-pitched sound that occurs when vocal cords are relaxed, has become more common, especially among young Americans. Research shows it's often perceived negatively in professional contexts, associated with lack of education or competence, even though there's no actual correlation. Being aware of this bias helps you make informed choices about vocal patterns. Matching vocal patterns to context and audience shows social intelligence. In formal presentations, more controlled and projected vocal delivery is appropriate. In casual conversations, more relaxed and variable vocal patterns feel natural. Yelling or harsh tones trigger defensive reactions even if your words are reasonable. Monotone delivery causes people to disengage even if your content is interesting. Your vocal delivery should support rather than undermine your message. Breathing patterns affect both your vocal quality and your mental state. Shallow, rapid breathing produces a thin, strained vocal quality and increases anxiety. Deep breathing from the diaphragm produces a fuller, more resonant vocal quality and promotes calm confidence. Before important communications, take several deep breaths to center yourself, oxygenate your brain, and activate your parasympathetic nervous system. This physiological regulation helps you communicate more effectively. Appearance and grooming communicate respect for context and self-respect. This doesn't mean everyone needs to look the same or follow rigid dress codes. It means understanding the norms of your environment and making conscious choices about how to present yourself. In professional contexts, appearance that's significantly more formal or more casual than the norm draws attention to itself and away from your message. Matching the formality level of your environment allows people to focus on your ideas rather than your appearance. Grooming signals self-respect and respect for others. Clean, neat appearance suggests you care about how you present yourself. Disheveled appearance can suggest you don't care about the interaction or don't have your life together, fair or not. Strategic incongruence can be powerful when used intentionally. Deliberately mismatching verbal and nonverbal signals can communicate complex layered meanings. Sarcasm works through incongruence between positive words and negative vocal tone. Playful teasing uses mock serious facial expressions with friendly content. But unintentional incongruence creates confusion and distrust. When your nonverbals don't match your message, people become uncertain about what you really mean and tend to trust the nonverbal signals. Aligning your verbal and nonverbal communication creates clarity and credibility. Self-awareness is the foundation of effective nonverbal communication. Most people have no idea what their habitual expressions, postures, and gestures actually look like to others. Recording yourself and watching the playback can be uncomfortable but enormously educational. Notice what you do habitually. Identify patterns that don't serve you. Practice alternatives until they become natural. Environmental control allows you to shape communication contexts in ways that support your goals. Choosing locations, arranging furniture, managing lighting and temperature, and controlling noise levels all affect communication outcomes. Meeting in your office or space gives you more control and status advantage. Meeting in the other person's space gives them comfort advantage. Neutral third locations put everyone on equal footing. Arranging seating so you're at 90-degree angles rather than directly across from each other, feels more collaborative than confrontational. Ensuring comfortable temperature and minimal distractions allows everyone to focus on communication rather than environmental discomfort. Artifacts and props can support your message. Visual aids make abstract concepts concrete. Physical objects can serve as metaphors. Handouts give people something to refer back to. But poorly designed visual aids distract more than they help. Dense slides full of bullet points cause people to read instead of listening to you. Aim for visual simplicity that supports rather than competes with your verbal message. Spatial positioning in group settings affects influence. Sitting at the head of a table is automatically associated with authority. Sitting in the middle of one side allows you to see everyone and be easily seen. Sitting at corners or ends may cause you to be forgotten or excluded from discussions. Choose positioning strategically based on your goals. If you want to lead discussion, take a head position. If you want to build alliance with someone, sit next to them. If you want to challenge someone, sitting across from them physically reinforces the opposition. Synchrony creates powerful, nonverbal connection. When people move in rhythm together, they feel more bonded and cooperative. This is why music, dance, and shared physical activities build group cohesion. In conversation, synchrony happens through matched rhythms of speech, simultaneous movements, and coordinated turn-taking. When conversation flows smoothly with good synchrony, people feel connected and understood. When rhythms are off and people talk over each other or have awkward pauses, discomfort results. Chapter 12. Storytelling for Influence. Stories are perhaps the most powerful communication tool humans have developed. Our brains are wired to think in narrative form. We remember stories far better than abstract information. We're emotionally engaged by stories in ways that facts and arguments cannot achieve. Master communicators use storytelling strategically to make their messages memorable, meaningful, and motivating. The fundamental structure of stories follows patterns that resonate across all cultures. A protagonist encounters a challenge, struggles against obstacles, reaches a crisis point where change becomes necessary, experiences transformation, and arrives at a new state. This hero's journey structure appears in myths, movies, novels, and effective business presentations alike because it mirrors how humans actually experience and understand change. In communication contexts, your audience needs to see themselves as the protagonist of the story you're telling. When they identify with the character facing challenges, they become emotionally invested in the outcome and more receptive to the lessons or solutions the story offers. Framing your communication as the story of their journey rather than your story or your product's story makes it personally relevant and engaging. Concrete details make stories vivid and memorable. Abstract generalizations slide past people's attention. Specific sensory details create mental images that stick. Compare these two versions. A leader faced challenges and overcame them versus Maria stood in the empty warehouse at 3 a.m., knowing her company had 6 weeks of cash left and made the hardest decision of her career. The second version creates a scene you can visualize, which makes it memorable and emotionally engaging. When telling stories, include enough specific detail to make scenes vivid without overwhelming listeners with irrelevant information. The details you choose should serve the story's purpose and theme. Conflict and tension drive engagement. Stories without conflict are boring because there's no uncertainty about outcome and no emotional investment in how things resolve. The protagonist needs to face genuine obstacles that create doubt about whether they'll succeed. In persuasive communication, the conflict often involves the gap between current reality and desired state, or between different potential approaches to a challenge. By framing this gap as a story problem that needs resolution, you create tension that makes people want to hear your solution. Emotional arcs shape how stories feel and what impact they have. A story that starts low and ends high creates an uplifting feeling of progress and hope. A story that starts high and ends low creates tragedy or cautionary warning. A story with multiple ups and downs creates a sense of realistic struggle. Choose emotional arc based on your communication goals. If you want to inspire action, show the journey from problem to solution, from struggle to success. If you want to warn against a course of action, show how an initially promising approach led to negative outcomes. Character development makes stories feel real and relatable. Protagonists need motivations, fears, values, and flaws that make them human rather than perfect or one-dimensional. When your audience can understand why a character makes particular choices, even choices they might not make themselves, the story becomes believable and the lessons become applicable. In business storytelling, avoid the temptation to make yourself or your company the flawless hero. Stories where everything works perfectly and success comes easily don't ring true and don't provide valuable lessons. Stories that acknowledge struggles, mistakes, and setbacks feel authentic and demonstrate real wisdom gained through experience. Dialogue brings stories to life by letting characters speak in their own voices. Instead of summarizing what someone said, quote their actual words. Instead of telling what someone thought, show their internal dialogue. This direct access to characters' words and thoughts creates immediacy and connection. However, keep dialogue authentic and relevant. Extended conversations that don't advance the story become tedious. Use dialogue for key moments where characters' own words are more powerful than summary would be. Structure stories with clear beginning, middle, and end. The beginning establishes the situation, introduces the protagonist, and presents the challenge. The middle shows attempts to address the challenge, obstacles encountered, and escalating stakes. The end presents resolution and reflects on meaning. This three-act structure feels satisfying because it mirrors how we naturally process experience. We orient to situations, struggle with challenges, and ultimately integrate lessons learned. Metaphors and analogies within stories help communicate abstract concepts through concrete imagery. Instead of explaining a complex business concept abstractly, embed it in a story where characters encounter that concept in action. The story format makes the abstract concrete and memorable. The lesson should emerge from the story rather than being explicitly stated. When you tell a story and then explain exactly what it means, you diminish its power. Trust your audience to extract meaning themselves. If you've crafted the story well, the lesson will be clear without explicit explanation. At most, ask a question that guides reflection without prescribing interpretation. What do you think that suggests about our situation? This allows the audience to own the insight rather than having it imposed. Personal stories create authenticity and connection. When you share your own experiences, struggles, and lessons learned, you demonstrate vulnerability and humanity that builds trust. But personal stories in professional contexts need appropriate boundaries. Share experiences that are relevant to your professional audience and purpose. Avoid oversharing that makes people uncomfortable or shifts focus to your personal life rather than the professional insights you're trying to convey. Other people's stories provide proof and social validation. Case studies, customer testimonials, and examples of others who've succeeded with your approach all provide evidence through narrative form. These third-party stories are often more credible than your own claims because they come from independent sources. When selecting which stories to tell, choose examples your audience can identify with. A CEO is more influenced by stories about other CEOs than by stories about entry-level employees. Parents are more influenced by stories about other parents than by stories about childless people. Failure stories, when told right, are often more powerful than success stories. Stories about what didn't work, mistakes made, and lessons learned through failure demonstrate wisdom and authenticity. They also make success stories more credible because you've shown you're willing to acknowledge when things don't work. The key is telling failure stories that demonstrate learning and growth rather than just complaining or making excuses. Show what you did wrong, why it didn't work, what you learned, and how you applied those lessons to eventually succeed. Transformation is the heart of powerful stories. The protagonist must change in some meaningful way through their journey. They might gain knowledge, develop new capabilities, shift their perspective, or fundamentally change their approach. This transformation demonstrates that change is possible and provides a model for how it happens. In persuasive contexts, the transformation you show should mirror the transformation you want your audience to undergo. If you want them to adopt a new approach, tell stories of characters who shifted from old approaches to new ones and benefited. If you want them to see a situation differently, tell stories of characters whose perspective shifted and led to better outcomes. Pacing varies between action, reflection, and description. Action sequences move quickly with short sentences and urgent tone. Reflective moments slow down to examine meaning and integrate lessons. Descriptive passages build context and create atmosphere. Varying pace keeps stories engaging and emphasizes important moments through contrast. Slow down for the most important insights. Speed through less critical setup. Unexpected elements maintain interest by violating expectations. Surprise twists, unusual solutions, or counterintuitive outcomes prevent stories from feeling predictable and forgettable. But surprises must be believable within the story's logic. Random surprise that doesn't make sense feels cheap and unsatisfying. The best twists reframe everything that came before, making you see the whole story differently. Callback references create satisfaction by connecting back to earlier elements. When something mentioned early in a story becomes important later, the audience feels the pleasure of recognition and completion. This technique rewards attention and creates coherence. Universal themes make specific stories resonate broadly. Stories about particular people in particular situations can illuminate universal human experiences. Struggle against odds, transformation through adversity, discovery of inner strength, importance of relationships, finding meaning in difficulty. These themes appear across cultures and eras because they touch fundamental human experiences. Stories should serve your communication objectives, not exist for their own sake. Every story you tell should advance your purpose. If a story doesn't support your message, no matter how good the story is, it doesn't belong in that communication. Be ruthless about ensuring stories earn their place by serving clear strategic functions. Chapter 13. Handling objections and resistance. Resistance is a natural part of any communication where you're asking people to change their thinking or behavior. The most influential communicators don't see objections as obstacles to overcome. They see them as valuable information about concerns that need to be addressed and opportunities to strengthen their proposals. The first principle of handling resistance is welcoming it rather than fighting it. When someone objects to your idea, your instinctive reaction might be defensiveness or frustration. But these reactions make productive dialogue impossible. Instead, treat objections as gifts of information. When someone tells you their concern, they're showing you what needs to be addressed for them to feel comfortable proceeding. Thank them for raising the concern and explore it curiously rather than dismissing it or arguing against it. Understanding the type of resistance helps you respond appropriately. Some objections are practical concerns about feasibility, resources, or implementation. These can be addressed through better planning, additional resources, or modified approaches. Some objections are emotional reactions based on fear, uncertainty, or past negative experiences. These need acknowledgement and reassurance more than logical arguments. Some objections are political resistance from people who feel threatened by change or who have competing interests. These require attention to power dynamics and interests. Some objections are habitual skepticism from people whose default response to any new idea is to find problems. These people need to feel heard, but shouldn't derail progress. Distinguishing between these types prevents you from treating emotional concerns as if they were logical problems or treating practical concerns as if they were just emotions. Listen fully to objections before responding. The natural tendency is to interrupt with counterarguments as soon as you hear an objection you can refute. Resist this urge. Let the person fully articulate their concern. Often as people explain their objection, they begin to see solutions themselves, or they reveal that their concern is actually about something different from what they initially stated. Paraphrase objections to confirm understanding and show respect. When someone raises a concern, before responding to the substance, reflect back what you heard. If I understand correctly, you're concerned that this timeline might be too aggressive given other commitments your team has. Is that right? This confirmation serves multiple purposes. It ensures you understood accurately. It shows the person you were listening. It gives them a chance to clarify if you misunderstood. It demonstrates respect for their concern. Validate the legitimacy of concerns even when you disagree with conclusions. Someone might have a concern that seems unfounded to you, but from their perspective with their information, the concern makes sense. Acknowledge the validity of their perspective before providing information that might address the concern. That's a reasonable concern based on what happened with the last initiative. Let me share some important differences in how we're approaching this one. This validation prevents the person from feeling dismissed and makes them more open to new information. Provide evidence and examples that directly address the specific concern. Generic reassurance rarely overcomes specific objections. If someone is concerned about whether something will work in their specific context, provide examples from similar contexts. If they're concerned about whether you can deliver on timeline, provide evidence of past successful deliveries. Make your evidence as specific and relevant as possible to their exact concern. Offer pilot programs or limited trials to reduce perceived risk. When someone is reluctant to commit fully, offering to start small can overcome resistance. Let's try this with one team for a month and assess results before rolling out more broadly. This approach addresses risk concerns by limiting downside while proving value. Acknowledge trade-offs honestly rather than pretending your proposal has no drawbacks. Every choice involves trade-offs. When you acknowledge them proactively, you build credibility. When you pretend they don't exist, people become skeptical that you understand the full picture. Yes, this approach requires larger upfront investment, though it will save money over 2 years. The short-term cost is real, and we need to be prepared for that. This honesty shows you've thought through implications and aren't trying to hide drawbacks. Turn objections into requirements. When someone raises a concern, ask what would need to be true for them to feel comfortable proceeding. This shifts from debating whether concerns are valid to jointly problem-solving how to address them. What would we need to do differently for you to support this approach? This question moves conversation from adversarial to collaborative. Find the kernel of truth in even unfair objections. Someone might criticize your proposal in ways that seem exaggerated or unfair. Rather than defending yourself, look for the legitimate concern beneath the unfair expression. They might say, "This is a terrible idea that will never work." Beneath that harsh statement might be genuine concerns about specific implementation challenges. Address those concerns without getting defensive about the harsh framing. Separate facts from interpretations. Often objections mix factual claims with interpretations of what those facts mean. Disagree with interpretations while accepting facts, or provide alternative facts while agreeing with interpretations. You're right that the timeline is aggressive. Where I see it differently is whether that makes it impossible versus simply requiring focused effort. This acknowledgement of common ground, combined with clear statement of disagreement, focuses discussion on the specific point of difference. Use the feel, felt, found technique for emotional objections. I understand how you feel. Others have felt the same way. What they found was that once they actually tried it, the concerns didn't materialize as they expected. This technique validates the emotion, provides social proof that the concern is common, and offers evidence from others' actual experience. Build on partial agreement. Rarely does someone disagree with everything about your proposal. Find elements they do agree with and build from there. You're absolutely right that training will be critical for success. That's why we've built in extensive training before implementation. Since we agree training is key, let's discuss what the training should include. This, yes, an approach creates momentum. Reframe objections as benefits. Sometimes what someone sees as a problem can be reframed as actually serving their interests. They object that your proposal will require involving more people. You might reframe that by saying exactly, which means we'll have broader buy-in and better implementation since more stakeholders were involved in the decision. The concern becomes a strength when viewed from a different angle. Know when to let objections go uncontested. Not every objection requires a response. Sometimes, acknowledging a concern without trying to resolve it is the right move. That's a legitimate concern we'll need to monitor. If someone raises an objection you can't fully address, acknowledge it honestly rather than trying to pretend it doesn't matter. Document that you've heard and considered concerns. When people feel their objections have been acknowledged and addressed, Even if not resolved exactly as they wanted, they're more likely to support or at least not actively resist. But if they feel their concerns were ignored, they may become active opponents. Throughout discussions, keep track of concerns raised and show how you've addressed them or incorporated them into refined plans. Preemptive objection handling addresses likely concerns before they're raised. When you know certain objections are likely, raise and address them yourself before others do. You might be wondering whether this would work in a small organization. Let me address that directly. This technique is called inoculation because, like a vaccine, it exposes people to a weakened form of an objection and your response to it, making them resistant when they encounter that objection later from other sources. Distinguish between real objections and smokescreens. Sometimes stated objections aren't the real issue. Someone might object to budget when their real concern is loss of control. They might object to timeline when their real concern is doubt about your competence. When responses to stated objections don't reduce resistance, probe deeper to find the real concern. What else is concerning you about this? What would need to change for you to feel comfortable? These questions can reveal unstated but critical concerns. Create space for private conversations when public ones become unproductive. Sometimes people object in group settings for political reasons or because they feel they need to perform skepticism for their team. Offering to discuss concerns privately allows them to drop the performance and engage more genuinely with actual concerns. Use questions rather than statements to address objections when possible. Instead of asserting that someone's concern is unfounded, ask questions that help them reconsider. When you say this won't work, what specifically are you picturing going wrong? This invites them to examine their own reasoning more carefully, which often leads them to realize their objection isn't as solid as they initially thought. Chapter 14. Ethical Influence and Authenticity. The techniques for influence are powerful, which raises important ethical questions. How do you use these capabilities responsibly? How do you remain authentic while being strategic? How do you persuade ethically without manipulating? These questions matter both morally and practically, since manipulation eventually backfires and damages your credibility. The foundation of ethical influence is genuine concern for the other person's welfare and interests. When your influence serves their needs as well as yours, it's ethical. When it serves your interests at their expense, it crosses into manipulation. This distinction isn't always clear-cut. Sometimes you might genuinely believe something is in someone's best interest while they disagree, but your intent and willingness to consider their perspective matters enormously. Influence that comes from desire to help people achieve their goals or avoid problems is ethical, even if you also benefit. Manipulation that primarily serves your interests while harming theirs is unethical, even if you can rationalize it. Transparency about your interests and motivations supports ethical influence. You don't need to share every thought or strategy, but being honest about what you're trying to accomplish and why builds trust. When people understand your motivations, they can evaluate your influence attempts appropriately. Hidden agendas feel manipulative when discovered. Open agendas allow people to make informed decisions about whether to be influenced. This doesn't mean announcing, "I'm about to try to persuade you." It means being clear about your goals and interests so people understand the context for your communication. Respecting autonomy means accepting that people have the right to disagree and make their own choices even when you think they're wrong. Ethical influence presents your case as compellingly as possible, but ultimately respects the other person's decision-making authority. Coercion, that removes real choice or manipulation that undermines informed consent, violates autonomy. When you respect autonomy, you can advocate passionately for your position while accepting that others might reasonably reach different conclusions. You present your best arguments, address concerns, and then let people decide. You don't punish them for disagreeing or manipulate circumstances to force your preferred outcome. Honesty is non-negotiable for ethical influence. You can frame information strategically, emphasize certain points, and sequence your presentation thoughtfully. But you cannot lie, mislead, or materially omit information that people need to make informed decisions. Deception might create short-term compliance, but destroys long-term trust and credibility. Even when honesty makes persuasion harder, it's required for ethical influence. If your proposal has significant drawbacks, acknowledge them. If your product isn't right for a particular customer, tell them so. This honesty builds reputation for integrity that serves you far better than any individual sale gained through deception. Understanding psychological principles doesn't make using them manipulation. Every communication involves psychology, whether you understand it consciously or not. Studying influence principles allows you to communicate more effectively, just as studying biology doesn't make doctors manipulative. The ethics lie in your intent and whether you use these principles to help or harm. Using reciprocity by providing genuine value before asking for anything isn't manipulation. It's appropriate relationship building. Using social proof by sharing examples of others who've benefited isn't manipulation. It's providing relevant information. Using framing to present information clearly isn't manipulation. It's communicating effectively. What makes these techniques manipulative is using them with intent to deceive or to serve your interests while harming the other person. Authenticity and strategy aren't opposites. Being authentic means being genuinely yourself, while also being thoughtful about how you express yourself. It means aligning your communication with your true values and beliefs while adapting your approach to be understood by your audience. Strategic communication respects both your truth and your audience's needs and preferences. You can be authentically yourself while choosing which aspects of yourself to emphasize in different contexts, just as you naturally behave differently with your grandmother versus your college friends, without being inauthentic. Admitting uncertainty and limits to your knowledge strengthens rather than weakens ethical influence. When you acknowledge what you don't know, you build credibility because people recognize you're not just claiming omniscience. This honesty makes people more trusting of what you do claim to know. Perfect confidence about everything actually reduces credibility because people know some uncertainty is reasonable. Admitting you're not sure about certain aspects while being clear about what you do know with confidence demonstrates intellectual honesty that builds trust. Considering the long-term implications of your influence attempts helps maintain ethical standards. Manipulation might work short-term, but damages relationships and reputation long-term. Ethical influence might require more patience, but builds sustainable success. Ask yourself whether you'd be comfortable with this influence approach being known publicly, whether you'd want others to use the same approach with you, or with people you care about. Whether this approach aligns with values you want to be known. 4. If answers to these questions create discomfort, reconsider your approach. Creating win-win outcomes should be the goal of ethical influence. Look for ways that everyone's legitimate interests can be served rather than viewing persuasion as one person winning and another losing. Often with creativity and effort, solutions exist that serve multiple parties better than either's initial position. Psychological coercion that leaves people feeling they had no real choice is unethical, even if you don't use physical force. Creating false urgency, threatening negative consequences for disagreeing, or structuring situations so people feel trapped into agreeing all violate ethical standards. People should feel free to decline your influence attempts without unreasonable negative consequences. Vulnerability and appropriate self-disclosure build authentic influence. When you share relevant struggles, uncertainties, or failures, you demonstrate humanity that creates connection. But vulnerability should be strategic and appropriate to context. Oversharing that makes others uncomfortable or shifts focus to your needs rather than theirs isn't helpful. The goal is shared humanity that builds trust, not therapy session or attention seeking. Listening deeply before attempting to influence respects the other person and makes your influence more ethical and effective. When you truly understand someone's perspective, needs, and concerns, you can determine whether what you're proposing actually serves them. If it doesn't, ethical communicators adjust their proposal or acknowledge it's not right for that person. Respecting cultural differences in communication styles and decision-making processes is part of ethical influence. Approaches that work in your culture might be offensive in another. Taking time to understand and adapt to different cultural norms shows respect and prevents inadvertent manipulation through cultural misunderstanding. Power dynamics affect ethics of influence. When you have significant power over someone, your influence attempts carry additional ethical weight because the power differential limits their ability to decline. People in authority positions must be especially careful that their influence respects autonomy and doesn't become coercion. Following through on commitments is ethically required once you've gained someone's agreement or trust. If you persuade someone to take action based on promises you made, you're ethically obligated to deliver on those promises. Failure to follow through isn't just poor business practice. It's an ethical violation that harms people who trusted you. Chapter 15. Integration and Mastery. Understanding influence principles intellectually is different from being able to apply them naturally in real-time conversations. Mastery requires deliberate practice, reflection on experience, and integration of techniques until they become part of your natural communication style. The path to mastery begins with focused attention on one skill at a time. Trying to apply everything you've learned simultaneously will overwhelm you and make you stilted and unnatural. Instead, choose one principle or technique to focus on each week. This week, practice asking more open-ended questions. Next week, focus on reading nonverbal signals more carefully. The following week, work on telling more compelling stories. This incremental approach allows you to integrate skills one by one until they become automatic. Deliberate practice means practicing with conscious attention to technique and immediate feedback. Having conversations isn't enough to improve. You need to practice specific skills, get feedback on how you're doing, and adjust based on that feedback. Record important conversations if possible and appropriate. Review them to identify what worked and what didn't. Notice patterns in your communication that serve you well and patterns that don't. Seek feedback from trusted colleagues or mentors who can observe your communication and provide honest assessment. Create a decision journal for important influence attempts. Before an important conversation, write down what you're trying to accomplish, what approach you plan to use, what resistance you expect, and how you'll address it. After the conversation, reflect on what actually happened, what worked, what didn't, and what you'll do differently next time. This structured reflection accelerates learning far beyond just having experiences without examining them. Study master communicators to see these principles in action. Watch skilled speakers, negotiators, and communicators. Notice what techniques they use, how they handle resistance, how they build rapport, how they structure their messages. Analyze why certain approaches work and how you might adapt them to your contexts. But don't simply copy others' styles. Use observation to expand your understanding while developing your own authentic approach. Role-playing difficult conversations provides safe practice for high-stakes situations. Before an important negotiation or challenging conversation, practice with a colleague who plays the other party. Try different approaches, get feedback, and refine your strategy. This rehearsal reduces anxiety and helps you anticipate how real conversations might unfold. Mental rehearsal also helps when role-playing isn't possible. Visualize important conversations in detail. Imagine how you'll open, what you'll say, how the other person might respond, how you'll handle objections. This mental practice activates similar neural pathways to actual practice and improves performance. Small talk and low-stakes conversations are excellent practice grounds. Every casual conversation is an opportunity to practice listening deeply, building rapport, asking good questions, or reading nonverbal signals. Don't reserve these skills only for important professional interactions. Practice in everyday life until they become second nature. Feedback loops help you learn from every interaction. After conversations, take a moment to reflect. What went well? What could I have done differently? Did I achieve my goals? How did the other person seem to experience the interaction? This brief reflection creates learning from experience that would otherwise just be accumulated interactions without insights. Seek challenging opportunities that stretch your capabilities. Growth comes from practicing at the edge of your comfort zone. If public speaking terrifies you, seek speaking opportunities. If conflict conversations are difficult, don't avoid them. If networking feels uncomfortable, attend events. Each challenge you face and work through expands your capabilities. Build your influence toolkit by collecting specific phrases, questions, and approaches that work well. When you notice a particular way of framing an idea that resonates, add it to your toolkit. When a specific question opens up useful dialogue, remember it for future use. When a story lands particularly well, note why and how you can apply similar storytelling in other contexts. Cultivate self-awareness about your natural tendencies and blind spots. Everyone has default communication patterns. Some are strengths you should leverage. Others are limitations you should work to expand beyond. Do you naturally lead with logic and need to develop emotional connection skills? Do you naturally focus on relationships and need to develop more directness? Do you naturally talk a lot and need to develop listening? Understanding your patterns allows you to consciously develop in areas where you're weaker. Energy management supports communication effectiveness. You communicate better when you're well rested, calm, and energized. When you're exhausted, stressed, or overwhelmed, your ability to apply these skills consciously diminishes. Structure your life to protect your energy for important communications. Prepare for crucial conversations by ensuring you're in good physical and mental state. Find mentors who exemplify excellent communication and can provide personalized guidance. Books and programs provide general knowledge, but mentors can give you specific feedback about your individual patterns and help you develop in areas most relevant to your goals. Teach others what you're learning. Teaching forces you to understand principles more deeply and provides practice in explaining concepts clearly. It also creates accountability for applying what you teach, since students will notice if you don't practice what you preach. Embrace failure as learning opportunity. Not every influence attempt will succeed. Not every conversation will go well. When things don't work out, resist the temptation to blame others or external circumstances. Ask what you could have done differently and what you can learn for next time. Track your progress over time. Keep examples of successful influence, difficult situations you navigated well, and relationships you've built effectively. When you're feeling discouraged, reviewing your progress reminds you how far you've come. Periodic assessment helps you identify what's working and what needs more attention. Every few months, evaluate your communication effectiveness across different contexts. Where are you strong? Where do you still struggle? What should be your focus for the next period? This ongoing assessment keeps your development focused and progressive. Contextual flexibility becomes important as you develop mastery. Different situations require different approaches. What works in one setting might fail in another. Master communicators develop a large repertoire of approaches and the wisdom to select appropriate tools for each situation. Balance structure with spontaneity. These frameworks and techniques provide structure, but don't become so focused on following formulas that you lose natural, authentic engagement. The goal is integrating principles so thoroughly that you can apply them fluidly without conscious thought, leaving your attention free for genuine connection. Ethical grounding keeps your development oriented toward positive impact. As your influence capabilities grow, regularly reflect on how you're using them. Are you helping people? Are you building trust? Are you creating value? Are you maintaining integrity? Power without ethics becomes destructive. Maintain long-term perspective on mastery. Communication excellence is a lifelong journey, not a destination. There's always more to learn, new situations that challenge you, and ways to continue refining your capabilities. The most masterful communicators remain humble students of their craft, regardless of how skilled they become. Apply immediately what you learn. Don't wait until you fully understand everything to start practicing. Implementation accelerates learning. Each real conversation provides feedback that deepens understanding in ways that study alone cannot. Integration happens gradually as conscious techniques become unconscious competence. Early in learning, you have to think deliberately about each principle. This feels awkward and effortful. With practice, techniques become more fluid, until eventually they're just how you naturally communicate. This is mastery, when excellence becomes effortless. Your journey toward influential communication transforms not just specific skills, but your entire relationship with others. As you develop these capabilities, you'll find relationships deepening, opportunities expanding, and your ability to create positive impact growing. The question isn't whether these principles work. The evidence is overwhelming that they do. The question is whether you'll commit to the practice required to make them part of who you are. Every master communicator you admire started where you are now, unsure and unskilled. What separated them from people who remained average was consistent practice, honest reflection, and commitment to continuous improvement. You now have the knowledge to become a master of influential communication. What you do with that knowledge is entirely up to you.